I'm Herman Bennett, a distinguished professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, who also is a faculty member in the certificate program of American Studies, Africana Studies, as well as Global Early Modern Studies, all at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'm a faculty member in what is called the Seminar on Globalization and Social Change, which was a Mellon funded seminar that became a part of an ongoing faculty seminar at the Graduate Center. And more recently, as of this past spring, I have become what you would call the executive officer of the PhD of a newly minted MA PhD program at the Graduate Center named Black Race and Ethnic Studies.
Well, it sounds like you're very busy. So thank you for taking the time out to talk about your book,
Yeah.
which I really enjoyed, though it challenged a lot of my preconceptions and some other things that I've read about, though I am trying to expand into African history with this series. So I think your book fits really well into,
Nice.
And it's called African Kings and Black Slaves. Sorry. Could
Right.
you kind of give us an overview of what the book is and how you came to approach the subject matter the way you did?
Okay, that's a great question. And one way to think about it is that early in my career, my previous work focused on kind of the social and cultural histories, notably the social histories of Africans in early Latin America, specifically Mexico. And one of the things that I have long been very interested in is the kind of administrative aspects that regulate the lives of enslaved people, but also not only did they serve to regulate, but they also created opportunities, right? So the obligations created rights. Obligations also created a sense of rights and a kind of formality there. And so subsequently, what was pretty clear to me in the case of 16th century Latin America is that individuals who we would identify as enslaved Africans very quickly, even if they couldn't speak Spanish or Portuguese, very quickly were able to materialize or to utilize the existing legal structures that were in place in the context of the unfolding conquest of Latin America, Mexico, Peru, et cetera. And that led me to think about how we have just sort of told the story of enslaved Africans as the story of slavery, as opposed to that there's a political history or that there's a previous history to the African past, right? And oftentimes, and when we do have that story of the African past, it winds up being a cultural narrative, right? These were their mores, these were their norms, and these were the kind of cultural expressions before they were enslaved or were made into slaves. And one of the challenges that I wanted to sort of take on was that what if we sort of thought about the European expansion as not one that was guided by our thinking about race, but one that was guided in a very contemporary sense, but thinking about it in relationship to how would late medieval, early modern Spaniards and Portuguese, among other Christian Europeans, how might they have processed those initial encounters? And one of the things that led me into, and this is what that shapes the book, African Kings and Black Slaves, Sovereignty and Dispossession in the Early Modern World, is that it was an effort to sort of say, well, their first optic, their perspectives, their thinking would have also been shaped by those encounters in which they were initially not looking just simply for a commodity or for that matter, for thinking about that they could just go and take and rape and pillage, but that actually they had to engage in diplomacy, right? Because you arrive somewhere, you're trying to figure out the landscape, like who's here, what's the nature of the dynamics of power, how is this place organized, and basically who is the sovereign here, which is the ways in which Europeans and other parts of the world engaged with local inhabitants. And that then led me into sort of thinking more carefully about the kind of political encounter that would have preceded the kind of cultural and social transformation that went into making enslaved Africans. And so there's a lot of effort in this book to both question the ways in which we start the story of the African presence in the New World, and also to think about that anterior history, to think about what that history would have looked like, and how Europeans actually worked from their own assumptions about how a society or how an order was organized, rather than just sort of our understandings that modern notions of race and racial difference and the abject and objectification and the kind of dehumanization that we have associated with slavery, and that packs so much of our modern sensibility that what gets lost in this oftentimes is the kind of complexity, the nuance. It doesn't excuse it. It doesn't justify it. It just is asking for us to be better historically minded thinkers about an important encounter that shapes the subsequent histories of the Americas and the modern world.
Yeah, it's a provocative take, and I think it's well argued in the book.
Thank
and
you.
I think so. Before we get into the different kind of nuances of what you unpack, give us a thumbnail of what the Spanish and Portuguese society was like, and why it was kind of poised to be a little bit more or a little different than other European medieval societies. But then also, and then we'll get into the African sovereignty, but let's start with the Western and then we'll move into.
Right. No, absolutely. And that's a great question, right? And even the very framing of the Spaniards and the Portuguese is something that's increasingly under questioning, because what we have to understand is that the people that wind up making their way into Africa, the society that they came from, was a very complicated mosaic, a political mosaic, in which they themselves were Christians cohabited with a significant Islamic population, a variegated Islamic population, and similarly a significant Jewish population in different parts. That also, and in both of those communities, and in fact in the mosaic of those three, of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, there's a long history of different kinds of rights and different kinds of encounters as a result of those rights. And so the history of Christians, Spaniards in relationship to the Jewish population is not simply one that we see in the late medieval period of, a relentless pogroms, a relentless exercising of power over that population to the point of forcing conversion and, if not, expulsion. But that there was a way in which the Jewish population occupied a very complex relationship to both the king or the sovereign, the monarch in these various Castilian monarchies, or the monarchies that are familiar to us with regard to what we would today call Barcelona and the counts of Barcelona, and then Aragon, the king of Aragon. And so that there's a complexity there that informs who the Spaniards are as a result of the existing populations that are there. Their history itself takes its form from the complex histories of the Reconquest, in which Christians had to engage in diplomacy, also warfare, but also engaged in forms of bondage, slavery, in the enslavement of those populations when they proved resistant to the will of the dominant group at any one moment. And that dynamic meant that Spain is something that actually is invented over the course of its long history, right? So the Spain that we work with, and oftentimes when we associate with Ferdinand and Isabel, and then subsequently with Columbus, right? Though he was, from Genoa, he was Genoese, but he nonetheless was working in the service of the Spanish monarchs. That Spain is something that comes into existence in the late 15th century, right? And it comes into existence having had a complex history to Islam, a complex history to the Jewish population, and in fact, the conquest of what we call Spain doesn't happen doesn't happen overnight, and nor is it just a singular act, right? There are ways in which the Muslim population that's conquered in Granada is also accompanied by an Islamic population that thrives throughout the peninsula, even though their lords have been long overturned and have long been expelled. But as long as the Islamic population would adhere to the norms of Christian dominance, they were allowed to exist there. And so the complexity of the Spanish history, and the complexity, for that matter, of the Portuguese history, is one that we are still unpacking, while we're at the same time asking for us to think about the Atlantic and Africa in a much more complicated sense. And so the Spaniards and Portuguese who encounter the Africans are in many ways a society that is not just simply one that's organized by a history of power vis-a-vis other people, but a long history of diplomacy, coexistence, and warfare, simultaneously to coexistence and diplomacy, and simultaneously also the establishment of rules of law and various kinds of rules of law. Not only just the rule of the king, but also the rule of the church, and similarly to the thinkings of the theologians, right? And so that there's a complexity to the legal landscape that shapes what Spain becomes, right? Because Spain is not just simply what the monarch says, but Spain becomes what the Catholic Church or the Pope suggests that they should be. And that kind of tension is built into what makes Spain, makes the Portuguese, and that has significant bearings on the encounter when Spaniards and Portuguese come to encounter the Jewish population, the Muslim population, and then subsequently the African populations.
Yeah, and we'll get back to how that interacts, the law and authority and sovereigns. But before we do that, I'd like you to now paint us the other picture of what Africa looked like right before these encounters happened. What was the political structure? How did they they were primed in a different way, right?
Right. No, that's a great question, right? They were primed in a different way is a wonderful way of framing it. Just like I was hoping here in my previous comments now on Spain and Portugal to sort of lend itself a kind of complexity that we are, as historians, are fully aware of now, which we may not have been as 30 years ago when I first entered into this field. Now, the same thing is true with regard to Africa. There are multiplicities of Africas that exist, right? There's the Africas in West Africa and then West Central Africa, and then there's the Africa that the Spaniards and Portuguese also encountered in Eastern Africa, and also similarly in Northern Africa. And so and as I said to you at the very beginning, we oftentimes reduce these kinds of questions into one of culture, right? Like this is how they were culturally speaking. These are their mores, these are their norms, these are their sort of cultural practices, right? And one of the things that we have done within African history has been, and it has been really key, is to recognize certain kinds of social and political forms that existed, right? That there were in fact states there, right? Yeah, that has long been a quest to prove in African history, to sort of say we have history here, and the way that history takes the form it takes is the incarnation of the state, that is of governance, of something of authority and governance, and where power is vested, and notably in the elites, in the hands of the elites. And so one of the things we have to keep in mind is that within all of Africa, there are just different kinds of modalities or different kinds of forms of political power expressed, right? So you have big kingdoms and empires. We have a history of that. And we know that really quite well. That's Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. And they played a really key role in the 12th, 13th century in the context of African history, right? We know Mansa Musa, for instance, the emperor of Mali, who Mike Gomez and others have written about, who played a really significant role in sort of shaping the European imaginary about what constituted the African kingdoms and about the wealth that was there, the power that was vested in the ruler, the Mansa, right? And that was not just sort of just in Mali, but somebody who traveled across to on a Hajj to all the way to Mecca and then Egypt completely transformed the economy by the sheer amount of gold that he allegedly brought in his entourage with him, so that the value of gold sort of just was deflated as a result. And then you also have, alongside these empires, you also had other forms of states, right? So one of the things that happens after the breakup of the Malian Empire is that you have various forms of rulers representing small kingdoms, right? Looking like the monarchies in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, right? You know, what we would call in Europe the Dark Ages, which was really an area which really represents the kind of breakup of the empire, the Roman Empire, and the lingua franca that was characteristic of Latin. And then you have these various monarchs and princes who controlled different kingdoms, right? Some were really prominent, like Charlemagne, but others were also quite small and were lords and princes in a local way. Similar kinds of forms existed within African history, right? So Mali breaks up, new kingdoms emerge, and those kingdoms really played a significant role in the encounter with the Europeans, because the Europeans are approaching in. Moving further south into West Central Africa, one of the things we find there is, notably in the area of the Congo, we find a really prominent kingdom that transforms itself into an empire at the very moment that it encounters the Portuguese and Christianity. And in fact, the elite there were fairly settled and ensconced in power. And at the same time, what they realized is that this new ideology that was associated with Christianity could be useful to in making them aristocrats as opposed to just being nobles. And so there's a way in which the kingdom of Congo emerges as a really important kingdom, but then subsequently becomes an empire, mostly through the conversion of the elites, the Congolese elites who appropriated Christian names and and Christianity as an ideology to distinguish themselves from their subjects and also their neighbors. And so as a result of that, there's a way in which the Kingdom Congo becomes a really prominent icon of political power for West Africa. And again, it's just one example of power, because there are multiple kinds of polities and multiple kinds of principalities, multiple kinds of kingdoms. And the key thing here is to keep focusing on the political form, right? The language we use to think about these polities, about these kingdoms, about these principalities is really significant. Language matters. And it matters to the point that if we start by saying, well, they're just tribes, then what happens is that we immediately don't associate tribes with a kind of political form or with a polity or with the ability to have diplomacy. And so what we have to understand is that language that we use to describe these social and political forms is really important. And because in fact, the Europeans were fully aware of that, because the word tribe, even though it was present within the Latin lexicon and it played a significant role, it was used by the Romans to describe the Germanic tribes, right? And so subsequent historians were using that language subsequently when they were explaining in the 19th century the distinction between African polities and politics and that of Asian polities and politics, and similarly that of Europeans. And so suddenly they went from kingdoms and lords to tribes and despots, right? And so language makes a big difference about how we sort of think about these places, and it's important just literally say there's a variegated forms of political expression that were manifest in the context of Africa. And last point on this, what I would say is even while we had something called the conquest of Angola or the conquest of Luanda that becomes the conquest of Angola, which happens in 1575. And oftentimes we as historians of the Atlantic, we historians of Africa, and of the slave trade and then of Africans in the Americas see that as a really transformative moment. And we sort of say that's when the Portuguese, and for that matter, the Christian Europeans, sort of have a balance of power vis-a-vis African, begin to have a balance of power vis-a-vis African lords and African kings. But at the same time, if you just shift your optic up to North Africa, the very same Portuguese wind up being in trying to conquer the kingdom of Morocco, right? And wind up losing their entire court in a battle in 1578. And as a result of that, as a result of the complete destruction of the noble house of the Portuguese and the death of Sebastian, the king, as a result of that, then suddenly Morocco prevails, but also as a result, Portugal winds up folding under the Spanish umbrella for basically another 60 years, right? And it's important to keep that in mind. So my point here is that we look at the conquest of Angola and sort of say, oh, the Europeans are dominant here, but they're not dominant in all places, right? And it's important to understand that there are multiplicities of Africa and multiplicities of histories that take place between Europeans and Africa in relationship to the continent, in relationship to the Atlantic, in relationship to the Americas, but also in relationship to Europe.
Yes, and that's, I mean, it's incredibly, when you shift your perspective a little bit, and it changes everything. Like even warlord, you say someone's a warlord, what's the only thing you have to do? Go to war with them. You can't negotiate. So let's talk about the Spanish and the Portuguese who came over, encountered these multiplicities of political formations, and how they interacted with them before we get into how that interaction changed into what we consider today to be the slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about how they negotiated authority, how they brought law with them, how they talked about the African law and what they respected, what they didn't, so on and so forth. So it's a big question and it should give you something to talk about.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I appreciate that question. Well, and it's important. One way to start with this is that the old story, the story that that you and I probably learned very early on in high school and one of these world history courses that we may have taken in high school, or may have learned in the first years of in college or have read, was one in which the Europeans arrived and they didn't just arrive as traders and as conquerors, but that they were also carrying with them on the other side they were carrying with them the support of the church. And the idea is that the papal bulls, right, that the papal bulls gave Europeans the authority to conquer those who were not Christians, right? And not only just to conquer those who were not Christians, but to actually, the rhetoric was that the rhetoric and the history as a result of that was that they were allowed to enslave those, they were allowed to conquer, dispossess, and enslave, right? And so that basically these papal bulls were seen as charters of European conquest. Now, in the book, one of the things I just did is that's something that I had learned as late as an African studies major in college, that's how Europe started its relationship with Africa, right? The papal authority was said that these people were different, they needed to be enslaved to be made into Christians. But so what I did is just like in a very, very rudimentary way, and this is why I refer to the colonial library in the book as opposed to only just going to archives, as I just went and read those papal bulls, right? And that requires, there obviously some of them are translated. Most of them now translated English and Spanish and German and whatever. But the Latin, if you look at the actual what those bulls say, they were basically giving the Spaniards and the Portuguese authority to how they were structuring the nature of the interaction, but they didn't say you can enslave those individuals, right? Because part of it is that they said you had a right to land your ship. You had a right to land your ship because that was what natural law was, and the laws of the seas gave you a right to land if you were in order to not drown or if you were desperate to find food and water. And similarly, it also said that you needed to be respectful of the existence that there are other authorities out there, including other authorities who were not Christians, right? So, and that itself is a long history of not just canon law or an ecclesiastical law, meaning ecclesiastical law, but that was also something built into the European legal structures, the systems of law, right? It wasn't just that law was property. It wasn't just Roman law, but that there was civil law, right? Roman law, but there were criminal laws, but there was also ecclesiastical laws, and then there was also theology. And so all of these kinds of legal systems and the thinking that associated with that, the opinions associated with it, tempered the papal bulls, right? The papal bulls were a document that the popes gave to a prominent king perhaps as a favor, as a form of patronage, as a way of interacting with them to secure support in certain kinds of political endeavors in Europe. But it didn't necessarily say, but those bulls also always needed to be tempered about what was happening on the ground. And what was happening on the ground was much more complicated. So if you read the bulls, if you read the laws, right, and we know what laws can say one thing, but what practices on the ground inform a whole different dynamic. And I think that it's really important to understand that the papal bulls, they come with a certain authority in our thinking, but that they didn't actually have in terms of the actual norms on the ground, the actual day-to-day interaction, and for that matter, they didn't shape how a king oftentimes interacted with his contemporaries or and through their various subjects. And so I wanted to be very careful to contextualize these papal bulls, to sort of say, well, when the Pope is giving the Spaniards and the Portuguese these bulls through time over the course of the 15th century, this is a moment when the papacy was at its weakest, and it was trying to secure the support of the energy and the authority of these increasingly powerful Spanish and Portuguese kings who were not only fighting against each Muslims in Spain and Portugal, but were also fighting against Muslims or potential allies against Muslims, including the Turks, right? So there was a way in which these papal bulls were given as accords, as a way of saying, now you have this license. But even then, with the licensing in hand, there were a lot of other things that tempered the enactment of the very practice.
Yeah, and then you also looked at the travelers' diaries and documents that they created in dealing with and when they encountered locals in Africa. And I guess it makes sense when you pull into a village or a town, you go to find who's in charge.
Right.
And when they did, they wrote about it in a specific way that was very interesting. So if you could talk about how they negotiated that and didn't just come in and like plant the cross and a flag and say this is ours.
That's exactly right. And John, you're absolutely right, and the travel writers are the ones who temper the papal bulls, right? Because you have the papal bulls saying, you may go and land and conquer the infidel and enslave those who are pagans, right? And then you would have, alongside that, you would have the travel writer, like say the Venetian the Venetian Caramosta, right? Alois Caramosta, who comes into West Africa, and it's important to keep in mind here that Caramosta writes what he writes before Machiavelli writes The Prince. And what we now know is that this ethnography that he produces, this ethnography is actually something that we believe that Machiavelli had some access to in crafting The Prince. And some of the language that Caramosta used about tyranny and despotism and others, which itself drew on the kind of Roman, but it also built on what he was seeing in the ground in Africa. And he was really adamant about saying the lords here are respected more so than any European or Christian lords are. And he saw that as a form of these were despots and despotism. And he talked about like the pure awe that these African lords manifested over their subjects. And so what he was doing, and keep in mind, he's coming into trade, and he can't just go in there to be a good trader. You can't just go in there. You can go in there one time and perhaps engage in pillage, and you can take something from a place. But what we also have seen that the Spanish and Portuguese understood very quickly in the 15th century, to do that at one time was possible, but to do that subsequently was an impossibility, right? Because the Africans understood what was happening. They could read the landscape from their side, and they were like, those people are the ones who came and stole some folks or attacked somebody that when they were here, or these people who looked like that were those folks. And so as a result, folks like Caramosta, they understood that it made more sense for them to discern what was the nature of authority in the landscape, who had power, who was the Lord, who was dictating, who was ordering and structuring the society. And they began to understand that it's through the relationships with those individuals that they could actually engage in trade and have the very trade sanctioned. It doesn't mean that the trade itself wasn't always violent, right? There were ways in which, like a lot of societies, there are ways in which the king can agree to something with somebody, but there still could be a lot of different dynamics in forming the nature of trade. But what they were really adamant at doing, and Caramosta and others were doing this, was saying like, you need to study the landscape. And it's by studying the landscape, understanding that power is really invested in an African prince, an African lord, or a sovereign, that's the way that we can ensure that the permanence or a kind of stability and a kind of structuring of what merchants want is in fact stability, the ability to minimize risk, to make sure that when they engage in an investment, that there's a return on the investment. If they build infrastructures of communication, infrastructures of patronage, or any kind of those kinds of diplomacy, they need to make sure that is actually going to yield the results that they would like. And to do so, they always preferred to deal with those in power, right? So this is really in some ways the history of European engaging in an understanding of power in the African landscape as a way of understanding the history, how to secure trade, diplomacy, and their own security.
So what went wrong? in so many words.
Yeah.
So we have one version of history is that this negotiation moves on a somewhat equal basis, and it becomes a different dynamic. Yeah. But what we have is more tragic and it's the African diaspora.
Right. And that's a great question. You know what went wrong is it's not so much what went wrong. It's like the nature of European societies changed, and simultaneously that also meant that the demand side the demand on the part of Europeans changed in relationship there. So on the one hand, we understand that the power dynamics between European and Africans over time became increasingly unequal, right? But that took centuries, right? That took centuries, right? It's not as if you had one encounter and then 20 years later the Europeans were dominant in one area. What we oftentimes do is compress a lot of time, right? The Europeans arrive in the 1440s, and it's not until really until the late 17th, early 18th century that the power differentials are significantly different, right? Significantly, where Europeans can come in and be able to dictate the terms. But what happens along the way is that and this is really important to keep in mind, is that and part of my story is that we have to understand that African elites play a significant role in mediating this trade, right? And there's no way around that particular kind of story, right? And it's about greed. It's about the nature of elite formation. It's about the nature. John, you there?
Yep, I'm here. Just keep going.
And it's about elite formations and so on. And so oftentimes what we do is that by asking ourselves, like, not what happened, not in the way that you asked it, but the way in which we do is that we sort of assume that all Africans would have an interest in other Africans, right? But we also know that the King of England has, King Charles cares about his subjects, but he cares about his family differently than he cares about his subject. He's worried about, succession. He's worried about their accumulation, right? And he's willing to do things that benefit his family at the expense of his subjects, and that therefore England. That's the same thing true in the context of the African past, right? An African ruler is acting to enhance his relationship or her relationship in relationship to their families, in relationship to their court, in relationship to other elites. And so African subjects, the poor, the laborers, the agricultural workers, those who pay tribute, and those individuals are not seen by them as one, even with the European presence. So that's actually an important part of the story, and we somehow have gotten away from that part of the story, of recognizing that within African societies, even with the slave trade, even with the tragedy of the slave trade, that there are ways in which African elites perceive certain people in this context, not just outside of their communities or outside of their polities, but even people in their polities, they perceive themselves as superior to them. And that dynamic of superiority is in some ways something characteristic of elite politics or elite perspectives in general. But there's another dimension to this, and that is not so much subjective or not so much reflective of the consciousness of elites, but it has a lot to do with the structures, right? So what we have is that Europe is expanding. It's going to Africa on the way to Asia. But at the same time that it goes to Asia, it also makes landfall in the Americas, right? And there's a need there in the context of the Americas for different forms of labor, right? There's a significant indigenous population, which initially was enslaved, right? In the Caribbean, many of the people there wound up being enslaved. Indigenous slavery lasted for a significant while really in some parts of the Americas, well into the 18th century, right? And at the same time, the Europeans are also interested in having complete control over certain groups. And it's harder at first they were able to and take them to different islands, and then they could secure their dominance over those individuals. But when that population eventually died out, they also were like increasingly had a scarcity perspective, a perspective of scarcity, and they were like, oh, well, we need to go further. We need to go to Mexico and get people. Now we have to go to Peru, and now we need to go into what we would call Patagonia or other parts of Venezuela. And then eventually, they also simultaneously, not just eventually, they also simultaneously turn towards Africans because their very experiences with slavery, with enslaved Africans, was one that characterized the enslavement of the Jewish population, different forms of, and Muslims who were conquered by the Christians and vice versa. And similarly, the Eastern European slave trade, which the Genoese and the Italians and the Venetians were really prominent in making sure that enslaved people followed into what was all previously Pax Romana, right? The Roman peace, the landscape that was characterized Pax Romana. So there were multiple slave trades there. There was a slave trade from the Balkans. There was a slave trade from in North Africa, and there was a slave trade of Europeans enslaving other denominations of Christians, right? Catholics seeing themselves different from other kinds of practitioners of Christianity. And so when Europeans turned to Africans, when they turned to Africans, they were in fact turning towards a well-known practice that was characteristic of late medieval European forms of enslavement. And so that they took that practice and introduced that simultaneously as they were enslaving indigenous peoples. And so that demand side played a significant role in the changing nature of the European-African relationship, alongside the power dynamics on the part of Europeans increasingly coming, offering many more trading mechanisms. And they also, the other dynamic here is that there's an increasing mercantilism, or an increasing mercantile dynamic that informs European societies. These societies are becoming increasingly commercial. Before they become capitalist societies, they become increasingly commercial, and the commercialization of the society allows for a kind of privatization, a kind of form of dispossession, a kind of form of identifying certain kinds of practices as necessary, which were not previously the case, right? Previously, the church could sort of say, no, you can't enslave people permanently, right? And now, as a result of this commercial dynamic that becomes the sort of prehistory of capitalism, that becomes really an important way in which the changing structure and system that informs European interactions on a global scale. And that is the kind of glue that helps the transformation of where we go from diplomacy and a recognition of diplomacy to increasingly one of commodification, right? They understand how the structures work, but now what they want to do is to make sure that the structure between Africans and Europeans allows for the transference of a commodity, as opposed to of African subjects who then become something else.
Yeah, great overview of that, and incredibly thorough. So I have one final question, and you deal with this throughout the book at various stages, and it's kind of the specter that haunts all of this, which is, it's not a why question, but it's how did then we get to understand slavery as a process that doesn't include all this, that has written out all this history and all this, what seems very intuitively basic, common sense. Like, of course, this is what would have happened, but like, why is it that we've created a slave narrative, a narrative around slavery that is so disassociated from the reality of probably what happened?
Right. No, that's a fabulous question. And there are different kinds of answers. One could sort of say this had a lot to do with the dominance of the American experience, in terms of the 19th century, and the dominance where suddenly people are like, this is the plantation, this is the nature of slavery, and the United States emerges out of the Civil War, this powerful experience that sort of shapes the story of, like, Uncle Tom's Cabin shapes the story of slavery, right? It shapes this, and we forget that Uncle Tom's Cabin is a late form of American slavery, of American slavery in the context of the United States, what becomes the United States, but it's also a late and singular expression from what we know to have happened in the Caribbean, or for that matter, throughout the Americas, right? So there are multiplicities of slavery that take place over the long 400 years of the histories of the Americas. The plantation isn't the only form that slavery assumed in the Americas, and yet the story that we oftentimes write from is the story of the plantation, right? Even the United States, where the plantation wasn't necessarily the most prominent vehicle to organize slave labor, that still is the vehicle that we work with. We think of, the big plantation, sort of, the image of the Gone with the Wind, right? This agriculture. And yet what we forget is that, wheat farms, those weren't plantations. They were wheat farms. George Washington and folks like that, they had a significant number of enslaved people, but they had them working on wheat farms, which was a different kind of form of labor production, right? But again, the story here is, on the one hand, it's the American story of the 19th century, the Civil War, and the narrative that comes out of that. But the other part is that complicates this, is that you have the Anglo experience, right? And especially the British experience, where they overturn that the abolitionists arise, and in a very quick moment, there's a shift in sentimentality and sentiment about what is morally just with regard to enslavement, right? And not. And so the abolitionists shape the story, right? Because part of their advocacy is to say, this is so horrific, right? And their imagery that they have, the image of that they have, is not of an indigenous person. It's not of it's a rhetoric of slaves, but the rhetoric itself is always framed in relationship to a Black body, an African body, and subsequently a Black body. And so as a result, the story of slavery, because of the abolitionist narrative, despite what they were doing, was really an important kind of decision to sort of recognize or to affect transformation, moral transformation in society. They nonetheless created a narrative that the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery created a narrative that this was the singular experience of slavery, right? And so that becomes then the story. That becomes the story of, like, the burden of Africans, the burden of the Black person, the burden of the Black, the Black being, and as opposed to thinking that slavery itself has a long history in the human experience. And that we are just, in a modern sense, what we are really just dealing with is just the latest incarnation of it, in which it's associated with the African, and for that matter, the Black being, the Black person. And as a result of that, alongside then the fact that we have the American Civil War, and that sort of shapes the narrative. And then keep in mind that the children of the losers of that war wind up becoming some of the very first historians in this country, right? Like when you think about, like, Woodrow Wilson, and you think about the Johns Hopkins School, the Johns Hopkins PhD program, right? That those programs there at Hopkins, and then also, for that matter, at Princeton, were really important in structuring and shaping the narrative of what slavery was, and what was the experience of emancipation, and what was the history of Reconstruction, right? So those three, slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction, those were fought over in the classroom. They were fought over in seminar rooms. They were fought over in the history books. So much of our disciplines, much of the work the world I inhabit as a university professor, is really the outcome of that because many of the children of the planters are some of the very first historians, some of the very first political scientists, some of the very first sociologists, right? Some of the very first medical practitioners who are working outside of the schools of theology or these kind of individualized medical schools, but are using their thinking, developing their thinking in a university setting, and they are curating our worldview about this past of slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction. And it's the American story that then becomes the world story.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to end it. Unless you have any like glimmer of hope in how this story is changing, are we moving towards a new narrative? Your book definitely does it, but are others joining you?
Yeah, I think that we're in a tough moment right now. I think that one way to put that is that we're in a moment where at this particular moment there is a lot of revisionism happening, and revisionism isn't always wokeness, right? It's another right? There's a lot of revisionism that sort of says, well, let's go back to that narrative, right? Because there was a questioning of this narrative of Reconstruction, of emancipation, and the role of natives and peoples of African descent in the history of the United States, and for that matter, throughout the Americas. And so there's an effort right now to undermine that narrative, right? That's why, this program is here, right? To maintain, it's trying to offer some counter narratives to the current narrative that sort of says, let's move past this, right? And I think that the reason why there's such an effort on the part of this current moment, the people who are orchestrating history and public memory, is because the threat has been so profound, right? You might want to reduce it to a kind of, they are reducing it to a form of wokeness, but what we are actually doing is they're sort of telling these complicated stories that allow for a kind of way in which we can collectively think about the past without just finger pointing. And that nuance, the subtlety, the complexity makes people, it has represented a challenge. It represents a challenge. If you want a simple narrative on which your ideology can be based, then those people like yourself and these programs like this, they challenge that, right? And there's a way in which this moment where folks are like, no, we want to get back to Confederate statues. We want to take down the commemorations about like indigenous peoples having a role in this, and the role of Latinos and Latinos in the history of America, and similarly the role of Blacks in their own experiences as like slavery and freedom, etc., and the American Revolution. If you take that away, that means that you're sidelining those individuals with the hope of reducing their agency. Right. And that's intentionality and it also is a reminder of like why what we are doing here, right? Having this conversation, why you're asking these questions, why it's so important, right? Because it gives us possibilities of imagining past that are intentionally oftentimes lost to us, right? So history is not a singular thing. It is a thing that we have to keep rediscovering and going back. We have to go into libraries. We have to live in libraries. We have to go into archives, and we have to do the reading. We have to learn languages, and we have to think about this stuff. And that is fundamentally important to not just what happens in terms of being a good citizen. It is actually fundamentally important to the world that we inhabit. If we can't think otherwise of other ways in which things have been done, then we will always be entrapped by a narrative that sort of tells us there are no other possibilities.